Hello and welcome. This is Microsoft Flight Simulator and this is the Phoenix Airbus A320. And today I would like to start the episode with a question. You are flying below 10,000 feet. There's very heavy rain. It's very difficult for you to see outside of the cockpit window. You lose sight of the airport because of the heavy rain. Are you allowed to switch on the screen wipers? Well, the answer is no, you're not. And why that is, and why certain numbers are very important in the cockpit of an airliner, and which numbers you should definitely commit to memory, this is what we will be discussing today. Okay, without further ado, let's get started on limitations. Alright, so the first thing I would like to discuss are speeds. Now, as you probably know, the maximum speed for the Airbus A320, which is called MMO, is Mach 0.82. In terms of speed, so when you're below the max switchover speed, that's 350 knots. So those two numbers you need to commit to memory as an Airbus pilot, 350 and 0.82. Nice to know, but not need to know. The high-speed protection kicks in at 350 knots or Mach 0.83. And if you go beyond 370 knots or Mach 0.86, the aircraft is grounded because the maintenance will have to do some structural checks. Some other speeds that are very important are actually written down here. So you have a placard to show you all the maximum speeds. In my company they expect us to memorize these, even though we have a placard and we are usually asked about them. The main ones are really the speeds that have to do with the gear, because that is something you will operate, and on the PFD there are no maximum or minimum speed indications for the gear. So this is something we in the cockpit really have to know. So gear extended, very easy, is 280 knots. So with the gear down you can fly up to 280 knots. To put the gear down you need to be at 250 knots, but to put it up you need to be at 220 knots. So what that means is, if you have hot brakes, there is a procedure where you just keep the landing gear extended. You have two choices: either you stay below 220 knots, so you can always put it up, or you speed up to 250, and then in order to put it up you slow the aircraft back down to 220. We usually do the first option. It's just a bit safer and there's less margin for error. Another speed we need to commit to memory is the maximum speed to open the cockpit window. Now you may be wondering, why on earth would you open the cockpit window during flight? Well, if you have a fire on board with a lot of smoke and the smoke becomes so thick that you cannot read the instruments anymore, you literally can't see anything, there is a procedure to simply open the cockpit windows, and that will drag out all the smoke. Now the maximum speed for the cockpit windows is 200 knots, so you will have to slow down to that speed. This to me is a bit theoretical, because if I'm in a situation where I can't see anything anymore, I will not be able to know how fast I'm flying. But that's just what Airbus says: slow down to 200 knots and then you can open the cockpit window. Another number we need to commit to memory has to do with the cabin pressure system. So when you press here on pressure, it gives you this nice little page with an overview. And the number we are really interested in is this one here, and this is the pressure differential. So in other words, the difference between the pressure inside the aircraft and the outside world. And there are two limitations that are very important. The maximum positive differential pressure, so in other words, the pressure inside the aircraft is higher than outside, that the aircraft can handle, is 9 psi. So you can see here with 6.7, so well below. 8 you can see here, and then 9 is already in the red. So 9 psi is the absolute maximum the aircraft can handle. In fact, if you reach 8.6 psi, the safety relief valve will open, meaning that a lot of air will stream out of the cabin to keep this differential pressure in check. But there's also the chance that maybe the pressure inside the aircraft is lower than the outside pressure. So maybe if you land at an airport that is below mean sea level and the cabin has been pressurized and you come into land, then the maximum negative differential cannot be more than 1 psi. After that it gets a bit dangerous. And the pressure differential brings me neatly to the next topic. And the next topic is runways and maximum altitudes. So the maximum altitude you're probably familiar with is flight level 3908. That's the max cruise altitude for the Airbus A320. If you have a flight plan route in here with weights and everything and the aircraft is not heavy, then 398 is what's usually displayed here as the maximum altitude, because it's the maximum that the aircraft can do. But what about runways? So what is the highest runway an A320 can take off and land from? Well, it is 9,200 feet above mean sea level. Pretty high. I'm actually not sure how many airports there are at that higher altitude. Also interesting, the lowest altitude is minus 2,000 feet below mean sea level. Again, I'm actually not aware of any airports that are that far below mean sea level. I don't know, maybe you know about one of them. Please let me know, I'd be interested to take a look. The next speed I want to talk about has to do with what I discussed in the introduction, and that is the maximum speed here of the windscreen wipers. So the maximum speed, which is called the max wiper speed, is 230 knots. So if you fly 250, you're not allowed to switch them on. You need to slow down to 230. And this is why we usually only use them when we're on finals. Another interesting speed is the speed that has to do with the gear in terms of the tires. Now, where I am operating, this speed is never really relevant, but I've heard at very high altitude airports on hot days with heavy aircraft, this can actually become an issue, and that is the maximum speed for the tires, and that is 195 knots. So once you go beyond that, the tires are no longer able to keep up and may get damaged. Let's stick with runways for a moment. So you're probably aware that the so-called nominal width of a runway is 45 meters. Some airports have 60 meter wide runways, but that's absolutely fine. The wider the better. However, the minimum we can do is 30 meters. So any runway that is narrower than 30 meters is no longer certified for A320 operations. Another factor is the slope, and with the slope it makes no difference whether it is uphill or downhill. The maximum slope for the A320 series is plus minus 2%. Once a slope is higher or lower than that, you cannot land with this aircraft. And that leaves us with the last three numbers, which is wind speeds. Now, I did an entire video about operating in windy conditions, and we discussed a whole long list of maximum wind speeds, but the ones you should have in your head at all times is the crosswind limit for landing, which is 30 knots, gusting 38. This is for the A320 series, of course. And if you are in low visibility conditions, so the visibility is less than 200 meters, then for takeoff it's 10 knots, and for landing it's 20 knots crosswind. So those are the ones you should sort of commit to memory, because they can crop up very quickly. The rest, you know, for that we have a table. Usually we look at the airport and the runway conditions well in advance. We look at the table, and therefore we know our max crosswind limitations for that particular runway with that particular weather, because they are different between 30 meter wide and 45 meter wide. And then it depends on the runway condition. Is there snow? Is there ice? Is there water? Etc., etc., etc. There are so many figures we are not expected to memorize all of them. But those three, ideally, we should know because they come up all the time. And with that, we have already reached the end of this video. So sorry there were a lot of numbers in there, but you know, flying an airliner has a lot to do with memorizing numbers and sticking to certain procedures and limitations. And I felt it's important to discuss them. After all, we are being tested on these things on a regular basis. And if you are a serious simmer on the A320 series, try to at least memorize some of those numbers. They might come in handy. Okay, and that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Until then, all the best. Bye bye.